Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bhagavad-gita Satsang webinar series. My name is Hari-kirtana. I'm very, very happy to be here with you, and I thank you very much for taking the time to spend here with me. My intention for this webinar series is to give you keys to unlock the secrets of the Bhagavad-gita, which, by the way, are secrets that are hiding in plain sight. And my job, as I see it, is to shine a light on those secrets to make them all the more obvious and accessible to you. I would like also to show you ways to make the Gita a part of your life, a part of your regular yoga practice, insofar as how we all live our yoga every single day. The Bhagavad-gita tells us how it is to be understood and how to practically apply the teachings of the Bhagavad-gita. If you are interested in understanding the Bhagavad-gita and seeing how these ancient teachings can be practically applied in your modern life, you are in the right place. It does not matter if you have never read the Bhagavad-gita, if you are just starting to read the Bhagavad-gita, if you have tried to read the Bhagavad-gita, if you have read the Bhagavad-gita even many times. I'm confident that you will find things in this webinar that will help you deepen your relationship with the Bhagavad-gita if you've been reading it, and get your relationship with the Bhagavad-gita off to a great start if you are just now entering into the mysteries of the Bhagavad-gita. I myself first read the Bhagavad-gita when I was a teenager. I read Siddhartha actually first when I was about 14, and that was what convinced me that my spiritual journey would take me through India. My first edition copy of Be Here Now got a lot of work, and that's what gave some sense of form and substance to the spiritual practice that I was looking for. But the first time I tried reading Bhagavad-gita, it went right over my head. I didn't understand a bit of it, but I was attracted to it. So I tried again. And the second time I read it, I felt as if I understood enough to not accept it. What the Bhagavad-gita seemed to be telling me was something I really wasn't anxious to hear or ready to hear. Nonetheless, my attraction to the Bhagavad-gita remained, and a few years later I tried again. But this time, third time being a charm, the circumstances were a little different. And I think that those circumstances are what allowed me to develop a relationship with the Bhagavad-gita, begin to understand it, and also develop the ability to accept it and try to act on what it was the Bhagavad-gita was telling me. I'll talk a little bit more about my experience of reading the Bhagavad-gita the third time around a little bit later in our discussion. A little bit of housekeeping. So just to give you a tour of the webinar technology, how it works, up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a menu that will allow you to adjust your audio settings. So you can click on that if you're not hearing me well enough. If you need to raise your volume, change your device, you can make your adjustments there. You will also see in the window that you have the opportunity to raise your hand. So if you can hear me, please raise your hand, and I will be able to see that you are raising your hand. Thank you very much. You will not need your own microphone, as you are muted, and I will not be able to hear you, nor will the other participants be able to hear you. You will not need your video camera, because you can see me, but I cannot see you. The raising your hand option, you've already seen. You also have viewing options that you can adjust. You can type into the Q&A box, and I will be able to see and address your questions. So if you'd be kind enough to do that right now, type something into the Q&A box, and that way we'll know that that works, and I can acknowledge your question. So Jessica took me literally and typed something in the Q&A box. Thank you, Jessica, you win. All right. Tonight's program, here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about why one should study the Bhagavad-gita, what one hopes to get from the Bhagavad-gita. And you can type into the Q&A box, instead of a question, you can type in, what is your motivation for being here? Why would you like to learn about the Bhagavad-gita or learn more about the Bhagavad-gita? So please go ahead and do that. My feeling is that why one studies the Bhagavad-gita is related very directly to an understanding of what the Bhagavad-gita is and what the Bhagavad-gita is about. So to start, we're going to start actually before the beginning of the Bhagavad-gita and have an overview of what the Bhagavad-gita is, how are we to approach the Bhagavad-gita based on what it is or what our understanding of what it is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Bhagavad-gita is about. And by giving you this contextual framework for what the Bhagavad-gita is about, I think that will make it easier for you to read the Bhagavad-gita, follow the dialogue, and see the progression of transformation that occurs in the Bhagavad-gita. Then we'll talk about how one should study the Bhagavad-gita. In other words, what is the best way to approach the Gita in order to gain a complete understanding of the Bhagavad-gita's message. So we'll talk about that as well. All right. So many of you would like to simply deepen your understanding of the Bhagavad-gita. Some of you would like to be able to integrate the teachings of the Bhagavad-gita into your yoga classes as you are a yoga teacher. So certainly for yoga teachers, the Bhagavad-gita is a very important seminal text in the philosophy and practice of yoga. And some of you have taken the yoga teacher training wherein the Bhagavad-gita was discussed, and you want to go deeper there. For some of you, this is an introduction to the Bhagavad-gita, your very first foray into the Gita. So we have some very, very nice reasons for wanting to study the Bhagavad-gita. I hope to fulfill all of them. Okay. There are no shortcuts to understanding the Bhagavad-gita. And as such, we're going to structure this webinar in such a way so that we look at clusters of verses that are related to one another and then go deep into that particular section of verses, that segment of verses. There are 700 verses in the Bhagavad-gita, and if on average we cover 7 verses a night, that's 100 episodes of this webinar series. So I'm looking at this as a 2-year project. I expect that it will take that much time to truly cover everything that there is to cover in the Bhagavad-gita. And as we go forward, we will go deeper and deeper and deeper into the Gita. So I hope you will plan to stay with me for this series. As I said, there are no shortcuts. So the question now, again, why study the Bhagavad-gita, is directly related to this idea of what is the Gita about? What is the Bhagavad-gita? Where does it come from? And what is the Gita about? So I have a multiple choice question for you, and here it is. Please tell me if you think the Bhagavad-gita is a product of human speculation or divine revelation, or is it somehow both, or is it none of the above? So please enter your choice into our multiple choice question. The question of where does the Gita come from is a source of different points of view. That is to say, when you read introductions to the Bhagavad-gita, naturally an author addresses this issue of how is it that we have the Bhagavad-gita? Who is the author of the Bhagavad-gita? How has the Bhagavad-gita developed from an historical perspective? Do we take it literally? Do we take it metaphorically? Etc. So it's an important question to determine what your approach to the Bhagavad-gita will be. How do you consider it? So based on your feedback from this multiple choice question, we have about half and half. Most of you are thinking that this is a book of either divine revelation or somehow a combination of divine revelation and human speculation. The idea that a person can be inspired with transcendental knowledge and then transmit that transcendental knowledge. So good. The way we think of the Bhagavad-gita will determine how we approach the Bhagavad-gita. So what I'd like you to do during the course of this webinar series is, as we look at clusters of verses, consider both points of view. Look at the verses as products of human speculation. Look at the verses as products of divine revelation. Look at the verses as a product of divine revelation that is transmitted through human beings who are searching for the truth. And then decide for yourself which way of looking at these verses makes the most sense, resonates with you, feels right. And perhaps it's one or the other, or both. You will find perhaps that you can reconcile, as at least half of you seem to think already, these two ideas, that the Bhagavad-gita is a product of human speculation and divine revelation somehow at the same time. All right, thank you very much for your participation. Okay. So now the question becomes, what does the Bhagavad-gita say that it is? Remember, I said earlier that the Bhagavad-gita tells us how it is to be understood. So let's find out what the Bhagavad-gita thinks the Bhagavad-gita is. This verse from the 9th chapter gives Krishna's point of view as to what it is he is offering us in the teachings of the Bhagavad-gita. And one of the things I'm offering you, in addition to the Bhagavad-gita as a philosophical treatise, is an opportunity to brush up on your Sanskrit chanting. So as you can see in this verse, we have the Sanskrit rendered in a transliteration. So Sanskrit transliteration means that the Sanskrit is rendered in the Roman alphabet with what are called diacritics, markings that give you an indication of how each letter is pronounced. So for example, we see here in this first line, there is a bar over a few of the A's, and that indicates that that A is pronounced in a way that is open and a little more elongated, as opposed to the A that does not have the bar over it. At the end of that first line, you see a dot over the M. What that means is when you pronounce the M, you don't just close your lips in front of your teeth as we do with a normal M in English, but rather you also bring the back of your tongue up against the back of the roof of your mouth so that you're rounding the inside of your mouth as if you're wrapping your mouth around a little walnut. So it becomes a little more of a nasal sound. So here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to chant the line, each line of this verse, and then I'm going to give you some time to chant it back. Here we go. Raja Vidya Raja Guyam Pavitram Idam Uttamam Pratyakshaavagamam Dharmyam Susukham Kartum Avyayam. Notice that I have highlighted the word dharmyam. That is particularly significant in this verse. Here's your translation. This knowledge is the king of all knowledge, Raja Vidya. The word vidya, often used to indicate knowledge, is the root word of the English word video, projected light. So vidya can be thought of as not just knowledge, but illumination, the ability to see things as they are due to the presence of light. Avidya, often translated as ignorance, indicates the absence of light, being a negating prefix, like in ahimsa, non-violence. So avidya means no light, can't see. But this is the king of illumination, the ultimate form of knowledge. The most secret of all secrets, as I said earlier, a secret hiding in plain sight. And the ultimate purifier. So there's 3 good reasons right there to study the Bhagavad-gita. Realized by direct perception, this transcendental science, also a very important word. It is a science. It is scientific insofar as there's a theory. You can do an experiment to verify the theory and see if it works. Is everlasting, the everlasting and supremely joyful perfection of religious principles. So religious principles is how I have defined Dharma from this verse. The Bhagavad-gita is unavoidably the intersection of yoga and religion. And this intersection is not always very easy to navigate. So I want to take a few moments to speak about this idea of religion in the Bhagavad-gita. In order to understand how the word religion is used in the Bhagavad-gita, we have to look at the Latin root of the word religion. So we start with re. Again, as in repeat. Ligio, to bind or connect, as in ligament, what connects your muscles to your bones, or a ligature, if you need to repair some part of your body and you need to bind something back to where it was or where it came from. So the word religion means, again, to connect or reunion. It doesn't mean a religion like Hinduism or Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism. And yoga means union. So here we have religion as reunion and yoga as union. So in this sense, religion and yoga, the words religion and yoga are synonyms. And principles of religion are therefore principles of yoga, of union. The Bhagavad-gita is a book of universal religious principles. And yoga is understood to be a means to religious experience that does not depend on or necessarily conflict with any particular form of faith. We'll get into this on an even deeper level as we go through this series. But the main idea for right now is this idea that religion in the Bhagavad-gita doesn't mean Hinduism. If you study the Bhagavad-gita, and you start to practice the teachings of the Bhagavad-gita, does not mean that you are becoming a Hindu, that you are converting to Hinduism, nor does it mean that the speaker of the Bhagavad-gita is a Hindu God as opposed to the supreme being who shows up in all faith forms. Okay, so according to the Bhagavad-gita is a book of transcendental knowledge. And now we can decide whether or not we accept this proposition. Okay. The Bhagavad-gita is also a book of transformation, and there's a sequence of transformation that we can follow in the Bhagavad-gita. So this sequence goes like this. Arjuna is our role model. He is hearing the teachings of the Bhagavad-gita from Krishna, and his starting point is our starting point. He is in material consciousness or conditional dharma. He's worried about fighting this battle that is about to begin, and his anxiety is based in his material consciousness, his misidentification of the self with the not self, and his misunderstanding of the situation that he's in, because he's looking at it from a material perspective. And what Krishna is going to do is change the whole context of Arjuna's experience in order to bring him to a state of spiritual consciousness or constitutional dharma. So the difference here is conditional dharma is dharma based on temporary conditions of the mind, body, time, place, and circumstance here in the material world. Whereas constitutional dharma is our eternal spiritual nature. Or as Patanjali puts it in the Yoga Sutras, our true nature. Patanjali begins with a definition of yoga. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. Then he explains why you would want to still the fluctuations of the mind. Because once the fluctuations of the mind have been stilled, then one resides in one's own true nature, or the seer sees themselves as they truly are. This is constitutional dharma. And the bridge between conditional dharma and constitutional dharma, what unites them or harmonizes them, is yoga. Now here's the really far out part. When you cross the bridge from your conditional dharma to your constitutional dharma, you don't actually leave the side of the bridge you started from. You can actually be in two places at once. That's the mystic power of yoga. A complaint that people have about this idea of a distinction between a spiritual consciousness and a material body is that it's a split. It's a toxic kind of diminution of the importance of life in the material world. But what the Bhagavad-gita teaches us is that transcending material consciousness into the state of spiritual consciousness does not mean abandoning one's material dharma or material position, but rather it's the unification of your conditional dharma with your constitutional dharma so that you can move through the world and face the challenges of the world from a transcendental position that empowers one to act forcefully and positively in the world. So yoga in the Bhagavad-gita is the art and science of harmonizing our conditional dharma with our constitutional dharma, which brings us to, what do we mean when we say dharma? I'll get to that in just a moment. There are 4 kinds of yoga spoken about in the Bhagavad-gita that act as bridges between our conditional and constitutional dharmas. Karma yoga, the yoga of action, which means action performed without attachment to the results and for the purpose of making an offering to that which is greater than ourselves. Ashtanga yoga, mystic yoga. This is the eightfold path of yoga described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. The Bhagavad-gita is understood to have been composed before the Yoga Sutras. So usually when we read the Yoga Sutras, we understand that Patanjali is presenting a system that already exists, and he has codified it in this Yoga Sutras. Krishna also describes, in summary, this same path of yoga, the same system of mechanical yoga that is designed to bring the mind under control, move the life force up through the subtle energy channels of the body, and give the yogi access to powers over material nature, but more importantly, gives the yogi the ability to see themselves as they truly are, and so much control over the life force that the yogi can choose to leave their body at a time of their own choosing, presumably an auspicious time for doing such a thing. Bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, the yoga of relationships, the yoga of connecting to the Supreme Person through offerings of love. And jnana yoga, knowledge yoga. Well, you can't love what you don't know, and you can't move through the world if you don't understand it. So jnana yoga is the yoga of theoretical and realized knowledge, the yoga of discernment, of being able to make a distinction between spirit and matter, and beyond theoretical knowledge, realized knowledge. So realization is applied knowledge. You hear, you act on what you hear, and then it becomes real. You experience this knowledge by direct perception. So these are the four kinds of yoga that are spoken of in the Bhagavad-gita. Now, this brings us to Dharma. I'm going to give you 4 definitions of Dharma. One is essential nature. So what I mean by that is, it is the essential nature of sugar to be sweet, of rivers to flow, of the sun to shine. If there's no shine, it's not the sun, because the sun is defined by the sunshine. If it's not flowing, it's not a river. If it's not sweet, it's not sugar. So Dharma means the essential nature of a person, place, or thing that you can't take it away, because then that person, place, or thing wouldn't be that person, place, or thing anymore. So it's that aspect of something that simply cannot be taken away because that thing is defined by that thing. Then, the best way to respond to your destiny is another way of understanding Dharma. Righteousness, or principles of religion, as I've already discussed. Justice is another way of thinking about Dharma, insofar as harmony with cosmic order, things being the way they are meant to be, is another way of thinking about Dharma. Yoga Shastra. Shastra means scripture, and scripture about yoga, the Puranas, and the various literatures, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad-gita, these are all examples of Yoga Shastra. And here's a definition that was given to me by one of my teachers during my recent trip to India. He says, Yoga Shastra is a compendium of archetypal karmic circumstances and the dharmic response to them. We have circumstances in our lives, and according to the Bhagavad-gita, what we are experiencing now is a reaction to our past actions. We create our own destiny. So we have both free will, we act, that creates a destiny for us, so therefore we have a destiny, and then once again, we have free will. How do we respond to the destiny that we created in the past that we're currently experiencing? So the Bhagavad-gita is a guide to how to respond to your karmic circumstances the best possible way, according to Dharma. The Bhagavad-gita is a book about Dharma. This first verse of the Bhagavad-gita gives us an indication because the very first word spoken is Dharma. If we apply some classical hermeneutics, then this is one way we can understand what the Bhagavad-gita is about. Hermeneutics comes from the Greek god Hermes, the messenger god. So hermeneutics is the science of understanding the message. One way you can understand the message of a yoga shastra is to look at the very first thing spoken and look at the last thing spoken and then look in the middle. So here we have the very first verse of the Bhagavad-gita, and once again I am going to chant this verse and you can chant back. So here we go. Notice the dots in the first line. This actually is a line that precedes the speech of a verse to let you know who is speaking. Uvacha, vocalizing, who is speaking. So you'll notice dots under the R and the S and the T. So the R in Sanskrit with the dot is a hard R sound. So it's not a R sound with your teeth out in front of your lower lip, but rather a R sound. And the dot under the S indicates a SH sound. Sh, 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 sh. The T gets a dot, and that means the T is pronounced a little farther back in your mouth rather than right up front by your teeth. Look at the last line. You'll see a tilde over the N in the last word, Sanjaya. That means that the N will have a little body English to it, nya. So you press the middle of your tongue onto the middle of the roof of your mouth and then do kind of a Curly from the Three Stooges thing, nya, 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 nya. Right above that, you will see an apostrophe or an accent mark over the S in the word Pandavas. Well, that accent mark also indicates that it's an SH sound, but it's a slightly different SH sound. It'll be an SH sound that is pulled back even further into the back of your mouth. So instead of sh, it'll be sh. Here we go. Dhritarashtra uvacha dharmakshetre kurukshetre samaveta yuyutsavaha mamaka pandavashaiva kimmakurvata sanjaya. In that second line, you may have, the second line of the verse itself, you may have noticed that I echoed the vowel A back at the end. The dot under the H at the end of a word, at the end of a line, indicates an echo of the vowel that preceded it. Okay, I have highlighted the compound word dharmakshetre, or phrase as the case may be. Dhritarashtra said, O Sanjaya, when my sons and the sons of my brother Pandu assembled on the field of righteousness. So here is the translation of dharmakshetre, at Kurukshetra. So kshetra means field. So Kurukshetra means the field of the Kurus, and dharmakshetra means the field of righteousness. At Kurukshetra, with their respective armies determined to fight, what did they do? So here we see that the very first verse of the Bhagavad-gita gives us an indication of what the Bhagavad-gita is about. It's about how did they act? How did my sons and the sons of my brother respond to their destiny that has brought them together on the battlefield? And now you might ask, who are these people? Who's Dhritarashtra? Who is Sanjaya? Who's Pandu? Who are the sons of these people? Why are they there on the battlefield in the first place? one question that we received was, should one read the Mahabharata before reading the Bhagavad-gita, or read the Bhagavad-gita and then read the Mahabharata? The Mahabharata is an epic poem, longer than the Odyssey and the Iliad combined, in which the Bhagavad-gita appears. And it provides the story context for the Bhagavad-gita. And one reason that people find that it is so challenging to get through the Bhagavad-gita is because we begin with this cast of characters that one quite reasonably thinks, I'll never keep track of these people. They all have really complicated names. Even the conch shells they're blowing have names. How can I possibly be expected to keep track of all this? And you never get through the first chapter. Well, for one thing, this cast of characters is a setup. And you won't have to keep track of them for the rest of the Bhagavad-gita. The only people that you really have to be concerned with are Krishna, who is instructing Arjuna, and Sanjaya, who is the narrator. Now, in our next episode, next week, I am going to reveal the backstory of the Bhagavad-gita. I'm going to explain in very simple terms who these people are, what their relationships are, and what they're doing here. Why are they on the battlefield? And that will give you some context so you understand the setup of how it is that we have arrived at this point of this battle between cousins that Arjuna does not want to fight. Now we look at the bridge, yoga. Early on in the Gita, in the 50th verse of the 2nd chapter, Krishna tells Arjuna these words. I chant, you chant back. Buddhi yukto jahati ha ubhe sukrita dushkrite tasmad yogaya yujasva yoga karma sukhaushalam. Notice how many times in this verse alone the word yoga and related words appear. Yukto, yujasva, yuj is the root of the word yoga, which means yoke, to connect, to have two things connected by a dynamic force. So here's the translation. Engaged in the yoga of discernment, okay, which translates our first instance of yoga. This is the yoga of knowledge, the yoga of being able to distinguish between spirit and matter. One is freed from both good and bad reactions to past actions, karma, even in this life. Therefore, connect all of your endeavors to the practice of yoga, for yoga is the art of all work. So this reflects back on what I said earlier about how yoga is the technology for harmonizing our work in the world with our transcendental nature, and how you don't have to abandon your material life or your life in the material world in order to be situated in transcendence. This is a very, very important idea insofar as understanding that this is not just a vertical ascension to another world and you leave the material world behind and trivialize its problems and challenges. Now we come to the end. Spoiler alert, I'm about to tell you how it ends. And that's in order to give you an overview of the arc of the story and give you a complete context, and also finish up this idea of hermeneutics, because the last thing spoken is the other way that you understand what was this all about. So here, Sri Bhagavan Uvacha, is an indication that Krishna is speaking. I put it in parentheses because it doesn't actually appear directly before this verse. It appears when he begins speaking, and this is a little ways into this particular passage of verses or section of verses that Krishna speaks. But notice, Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, not Krishna Uvacha. This is important. It is an indication of Krishna's identity, and we will discuss this later in our series. For now, I'm just going to chant the 4 lines of this verse. I chant, you chant back. Sarva dharman parityajya mamekam sharanam vraja aham tvam sarva papebhyo moksha yishyami ma shuchaha. So here I have highlighted sarva dharman. So once again, the word dharma spoken at the very top of the conclusive instruction of the Bhagavad-gita, which is, the Blessed Lord said, the Blessed Lord is a translation of Sri Bhagavan. Abandon all varieties of righteousness and come to me alone for shelter. I shall free you from all iniquitous reactions. Do not fear. So, iniquitous reactions, all of the unintended bad reactions to your well-intentioned actions is what that means. All varieties of righteousness are subordinate to one particular path of righteousness, which Krishna describes here as come to me alone for shelter. This corresponds, once again, to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, because Patanjali emphasizes Ishvara Pranidhana as one of the 3 actions of yoga, and most importantly, as the perfection of yoga. Right in the middle of the Yoga Sutras, we find a sutra rather, that says, Samadhi Siddhir Ishvara Pranidhanat, which means Samadhi, Siddhir. Siddhir means perfection. The perfection of Samadhi, of spontaneous absorption in an object of meditation, which Patanjali has already recommended as Om, the sound representation of Ishvara, is found in Ishvara Pranidhana. Ishvara is a philosophical term for the Supreme Person. So it's a non-sectarian way of describing God. And pranidhana, prana, the life force, dhana, offering. When one offers one's life force to the Supreme Person, then one achieves the perfection of meditation, of the yoga system. So there is this correspondence between the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad-gita. And we find it here in this verse, which describes the ultimate Dharma, or the ultimate path of righteousness, being offering oneself to the Supreme Person, or coming to the Supreme Person for shelter, sharanam. Okay. How does Arjuna get to this point? We can follow the story of the Bhagavad-gita by looking at Arjuna's progressive transformation. He begins, as we said, in a condition of material consciousness. And this is his state in chapters 1 through 3. In chapters 4 through 9, he's still not completely convinced. And he has doubt-based questions. Now, this is very good news for us, because if we get to like the 5th or 6th chapter and we're thinking, I'm a third of the way through this book and I still do not understand it, you're in good company. Arjuna didn't understand it either. So don't worry. In chapters 10 and 11, we see that Arjuna has arrived at a state of spiritual consciousness. And then what follows are faith-based questions. He wants to go deeper. He wants to know more. He wants his understanding to be complete. And so he asks questions now based on faith. In yoga, faith is the mandatory prerequisite for knowledge. We often separate faith and knowledge, as faith is what you believe, whether or not it's based on anything objectively provable, and knowledge is what is objectively provable, that which is a shared reality, as opposed to a subjective reality. Yoga puts these two things together. Faith and knowledge are inseparable in yoga. We'll get into that as we move along. At the end, by chapter 18, Arjuna is at the point of transcendental consciousness, which empowers him to move through the crisis he faces in the world, as opposed to renouncing the world and abandoning his responsibilities. Our objective is to follow in Arjuna's footsteps. The Bhagavad-gita is a guide for us to be able to walk in Arjuna's path. Joseph Campbell, in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, describes this as the hero's journey. The Bhagavad-gita is a guidebook for us to take our own hero's journey. So, how should we approach the Bhagavad-gita? How should one study? Svadhyaya, also spoken of in the Yoga Sutras, means guided self-study. It's not just speculation about who I am, nor is it solitary introspection. It's guided study, guided by teachers, guided by Yoga Shastra. We try to understand the process and condition of self-realization by hearing from those who have come to us having gone down that path and achieved a state of self-realization. You learn how to do something from someone who knows how to do it. You learn about being in a particular state of consciousness from someone who has attained that state of consciousness. So, first off, hearing from a qualified teacher, which of course immediately brings us to the question of, why am I a qualified teacher? Why would you want to hear about the Bhagavad-gita from me? My qualification for sharing my experience with the Bhagavad-gita takes us back to the third time that I read the Bhagavad-gita and felt like I was starting to get a handle on it. The way I studied the Bhagavad-gita was by hearing from qualified teachers, from teachers who were not only conversant with the theoretical teachings of the Bhagavad-gita, but had themselves, for some time, been living in accordance with the Bhagavad-gita's teachings. And I could look at them and see that the Bhagavad-gita describes how you recognize someone who has achieved some advancement along the path of yoga that Krishna is describing. And I could look at these people and I could see, oh yeah, they have these very same qualities that the Bhagavad-gita describes as the qualities of someone who has made advancement on this path. Therefore, I can have reasonable faith that they know what they're talking about. The other thing that I did was I studied in a class where we took one verse and examined that one verse and nothing but that one verse, but in the context of the verses that surrounded it. And this is contemplative reading. So the process of contemplative reading is you read until something stops you and you start to think about something that the text has inspired. You get some sense of insight or realization and you write it down. You just start writing with an old-fashioned word processor, pen and paper, because that just works better than typing or using a device, digital device. So you write and you keep writing until writing just stops all by itself. Then you read what you've written, and then you go back and you read the passage that inspired you to stop and think and feel and contemplate how this relates to you in your own personal life. So this is a way of reading that will help you develop a relationship with the text and with the speaker of the text, as opposed to informational reading, just reading to take in data. I did this in a community. And one of the reasons I'm doing this webinar is so that people who would like to understand the Bhagavad-gita can have a community within which to study. So with your permission, I will share questions and comments that you send to me, both during this webinar live, and also if you are listening to this webinar after the fact. If you have questions, you can send them to me. I'll give you my email address in just a little bit. And I will share those questions with the community so that everyone gets the benefit of either your question or your comments, your insights, your realizations. I know some of you are yoga teachers. You have some familiarity with the Bhagavad-gita. You have some progress that you have made on your own path of spiritual life. And sharing those insights with the group will be a great service and a great benefit to everyone. So I encourage you to please share with me your questions, your comments, and your personal realizations as we go along. The last element is a steady spiritual practice. The Bhagavad-gita is not meant to be armchair philosophy. It's not just something that you read for information and then you go about your life as if nothing has happened. If you do that, then you won't actually get the benefit of the Bhagavad-gita. It's kind of like studying, trying to understand honey by reading the label and studying the container, but without ever actually opening up the jar of honey and tasting it. In order to taste the Bhagavad-gita, you actually have to engage in spiritual practices. And the Bhagavad-gita makes recommendations as to what kind of spiritual practices are most conducive to understanding the text, to making the text realized experiential knowledge and not just theoretical knowledge. So as we go through the Bhagavad-gita, we will look at what these recommended spiritual practices are. In the meantime, whatever spiritual practice you have, I encourage you to keep it steady, increase it, or deepen it if you can, as your spiritual practice will be an essential element in understanding the Bhagavad-gita. All right, so just a quick recap. Why should one study the Bhagavad-gita? Because the Bhagavad-gita is a book of transcendental knowledge that acts as a guide on our own personal transformation from material consciousness to spiritual consciousness. When we talk about this transformation later in the series, we'll talk about why this is so important. Why would one want to do that? Why would one want to go through such a transformation? What is the Bhagavad-gita about? It's a book about Dharma, how to respond to one's destiny, and how yoga is the technology through which we respond to our destiny in a way that harmonizes our conditional nature to our constitutional nature. How should one study the Bhagavad-gita? One should study from a qualified teacher who you have reasonable faith, knows something about the Bhagavad-gita, based not only on their knowledge, but on their character. One should engage in contemplative reading, spend time with the text, and write about your own personal realizations. Study in community. Get the benefit of being part of a group of people. A satsang means a group of people who come together in order to try to understand the truth. So take advantage of being part of a community. And then finally, engage in spiritual practice. All right. If you have any questions, now is a good time to ask them. And if you are listening to this after the fact, then please, like I said, I want to hear from you and I want to hear about your questions. So some of the questions we have are about which edition of the Bhagavad-gita one recommends, and about the, we had a question earlier about the Mahabharata, which I've already discussed. Next time, I'll give you a little foreshadowing of what we're going to do in our webinar next week. Okay, if you have any questions, Hari@harikirtan.com is the place to send them. I am looking forward to hearing from you, and I'm very anxious to answer your questions, hear your personal realizations, and respond to your comments. Okay, editions of the Bhagavad-gita. Graham Schwag has a very nice edition of the Bhagavad-gita called The Beloved Lord's Secret Love Song. Now, as I go through this list, I'm going to speak a little bit about what I particularly like about these editions, but also some aspects of these editions that you might find challenging. The right edition of the Bhagavad-gita is the right edition for you, not because you're looking to an edition of the Gita that will validate your personal truth, but rather because everyone has a different nature and learns in a different way and responds in a different way and has different needs. So I'm going to describe each of these editions in such a way so that you can have a little extra information, at least from my point of view, in order to make a decision as to which edition of the Bhagavad-gita you would like, or which editions. If you already have an edition of the Bhagavad-gita, or better yet, if you have a few, or you have a friend who's got a different edition than the one you have, this is good, because one of the things that we're going to do in the course of this series is compare translations and see how the different translations inform one another or elaborate and expand the understanding, or maybe even conflict. Because as I said earlier, the Bhagavad Gita is presented from very different angles of vision depending on the author and depending on the particular school of thought that the author is writing from. So, The Beloved Lord's Secret Love Song by Graham Schwag is a wonderful edition that has fabulous textual illuminations that place the message of the Bhagavad Gita in context. Lots of information about all the different names that are used in the Gita when Arjuna and Krishna are referring to one another, so that we have an understanding of that. It's also a very poetic rendition. What Professor Schwag has done is preserved the poetic structure of the Sanskrit in the English translation. So you get a sense of the poetry of the Bhagavad Gita. The name Bhagavad Gita means the song of the Blessed Lord. So Gita means singing or song. And so this is poetry. This is poetic verse. And this is a very nice feature of Professor Graham Schwag's edition, is that he's preserved this poetic structure of the Sanskrit. One thing that you may find challenging is that sometimes, at least I find, that this edition sacrifices clarity for poetry. So it sounds great, but not every verse is really clear, especially when he uses the same word repeatedly in the same verse the same way, when in a contextual sense that one word might mean different things. So sometimes a little bit of clarity may be lost in favor of the preservation of the poetic feeling of the verse. H.D. Goswami's Guide with Literal Translation does just the opposite. H.D. Goswami's edition gives a very excellent explanation of each of the concepts in the Gita up front. The Gita is not a linear text, it's elliptical. So Krishna speaks and he goes through some topics, then he circles back and goes a little deeper and then a little farther and then goes back and goes deeper and farther and like that. So what H.D. Goswami has done in his edition is up front he's taken some of the concepts and subject matters of the Bhagavad Gita and made them more linear by describing the concept and then referring to each verse throughout the Gita that speaks about this particular concept. This is very, very helpful for one's understanding of the topics of the Bhagavad Gita and what the Gita has to say about each of these topics. His literal translation is very literal. So as where Graham Schwag in some places may sacrifice clarity for poetry, I feel that H.D. Goswami's edition sometimes sacrifices poetry for clarity. It's in some places a very abrupt kind of translation, and therefore the beauty of the poetry is not preserved in quite the same way as Graham Schwagg's edition. But it's very, very clear what is being said. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's Bhagavad-gita as it is. This is the edition of the Bhagavad-gita that I first read and failed to understand, and then understood a little bit but didn't accept, and then finally ran with in my personal studies. The Bhagavad-gita as it is contains what I feel is the most fluid and accessible translation and extensive commentary with practically each verse. Srila Prabhupada also uses some very specific language, some coined terms of his that you won't find anywhere else. And there are also references to other literature in the Vedic canon that you may not be familiar with. My recommendation, if you're going to get Bhagavad-gita as it is, go to the English translations and just read the translations all the way through first. Don't read the introduction. Don't worry about the Sanskrit. Don't worry about the commentary. Just read the translations all the way through from start to finish so that you get a sense of the flow of the Bhagavad-gita and how the subject matter works. If you read immediately verse, purport, verse, purport, verse, purport commentary, then you'll get halfway through a chapter and you'll forget what the subject matter is. So first read the verses all the way through in English, then go back and read verse, commentary, verse, commentary, verse, commentary. And that will help you to move through that edition. If you've never read the Bhagavad-gita, then I recommend Gita Wisdom by Joshua Green. It is a very concise and articulate translation. It's a very accessible translation and makes it very easy to quickly get the idea about what the Bhagavad-gita is about. So for someone who's brand new to the Gita and you don't want like a big scholarly tome with lots of commentary, this is a very, very good first edition of the Bhagavad-gita to get. Stephen Mitchell's Bhagavad-gita is a very popular translation, and the translation itself, as far as I'm concerned, overall is very nice. If you read the introduction and then come and hang out with me in this webinar series, you will find that what I teach about the Bhagavad-gita and how to understand it is completely different from how Stephen Mitchell presents the Bhagavad-gita. I will be operating from a completely different perspective. My personal feeling is if you read the introduction that Stephen Mitchell gives you to the Bhagavad-gita, it will undermine your ability to actually understand it. For the sake of comparison, however, go ahead and read it if you have that edition, and then decide for yourself which way of approaching the Gita makes the most sense to you, resonates with you, etc. Eknath Easwaran's Bhagavad-gita is also a nice translation. He, along with Swami Satchidananda, come to the Bhagavad-gita from a perspective of Vedanta, or specifically Advaita Vedanta, which means absolute non-dualism. And so you will find that in places there will be an interpretation that overlays one school of thought on another. So Vedanta means the end of knowledge. Veda means knowledge, Anta means end. So the ultimate conclusion of knowledge. And different schools of Vedanta have different angles of vision. There's not just one school of Vedanta, although Vedanta is often used as shorthand to indicate Advaita Vedanta, or absolute non-dualism. And again, by looking at various translations and commentaries and angles of vision of how different authors and translators approach the Bhagavad-gita, you can get a very nice cross-section of ideas about how one might approach the Bhagavad-gita, and you can decide for yourself which approach makes the most sense. I will be referencing various translations and commentaries and giving you my own sense of how to understand these various translations and commentaries as we go along. Some other resources. On my website, you can download a free 45-minute audio training called Awaken Your Spiritual Vision. It is Bhagavad-gita in a nutshell in many respects. And so you can get a very nice overview of the basic teachings of the Bhagavad-gita from this 45-minute audio training. You've already spent an hour with me here. If you find another 45 minutes to spend with me, I promise you it'll be worth every penny. It's free. And there's a little bonus that you will get as well. So please avail yourself to this free 45-minute audio training. I also have a book, as I mentioned earlier, In Search of the Highest Truth, Adventures in Yoga Philosophy. The subject matter of this book are the teachings that are found in the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad-gita, and I bring these two texts together in my book. It's not as free as the audio training. The audio training is completely free. The book is not as free, but I hope you'll think it's worth it. Okay, next week, here's what we're going to do. Chapter 1, Part 1, Observing the Armies. The first chapter of Bhagavad-gita is divided into two sections. The first section, preparations for war. Everyone is getting ready to fight. We'll look at the backstory. How did we get here? How did we arrive at this point where we have these two armies on the battlefield ready to fight? We're going to look at some verses that foreshadow Arjuna's victory. Arjuna and his brothers collectively are known as the Pandavas. They are 5 altogether. So we'll look at a little bit of foreshadowing that we find in the first chapter, and why Dhritarashtra, the father of Arjuna's enemies, is concerned about what's going on the battlefield in this particular place. And then we'll look at a really interesting aspect of the theology of the Bhagavad-gita, Krishna as the servant of his devotee. All right. I'm looking forward to hearing more of your questions and comments. Thank you very, very much for spending your time with me in this edition of our webinar series. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. Same time, same channel. Thank you very, very much. Hope you have a wonderful week. See you next time.